Okay, so we're going to move into session one, livestock in the crystal ball, and I'm going to pass over to Di Mayberry, who's going to facilitate this session. Di.
Thanks, Alan. I think I managed to meet about half the people in the room this morning. As Alan said, my name's Di Mayberry and I'm a research scientist with CSIRO in Australia. This morning we're going to be looking into the livestock crystal ball. So in the next 30 to 40 years, we're expecting to see a huge and rapid increase in the demand for animal source food, particularly in Africa. And at the same time, livestock producers in this region face many challenges, not least of which is climate change. So the aim of this session this morning is to identify some of the future trends in the livestock sector and to explore some of the potential impacts, challenges and opportunities associated with these trends. So we have four presentations this morning where our speakers will provide some brief insights into what they think these trends are. And then Alan has a group activity organised where we can discuss how the community can help the livestock sector respond to these challenges. So we have four presentations from Mario, Ugo, Luc and Obai and Claudia. Each of these presenters has 10 minutes. We won't be taking questions in between, so if you have any burning questions, write them down and I'm sure we'll get to them later in the session. So to start us off, Mario.
Okay, great. Thanks, Di. I thought that I was going to have a little bit more time, but just at coffee I was in, somebody pointed out that I hadn't read the email correctly and my time slashed in half. So I'm just going to give you a brief exposure to the current livestock projections and the trends to inform the magnitude, to inform the challenge that we have here. Data is one part, but we have we have a sector that is moving at an accelerated rate, and we need to be very fast in responding. And I think that we're not doing so. So we really need to find a way of increasing this speed. So let me start by first saying it's not very much discussed in this forum, but definitely there is a global consensus about the need for a more sustainable food system. And the last year has produced three seminal reports, the IPCC Climate Change and Land Report, the Eat Lancet report on healthy diets from sustainable food systems, and the WRI are salient examples of this trend that we really need to really work out on sustainable solutions. And livestock is a crucial part of this, of trying to achieve this. A lot of the things are based on trying to ensure that we don't transgress environmental planetary boundaries. But I would say that it's also important to link this to the SDGs because the human well-being becomes a fundamental aspect of achieving true sustainability. So it's the environment, but it's also about people. And when we work in low-income countries, this really means livelihoods, this really means dealing with vulnerable populations and so on, and trying to find solutions for them as well. Sometimes the debate on sustainability is too high-income centric, and we need data and evidence to really show how the solutions can be implemented in low-income countries. So the agenda has changed very significantly since we started thinking about projections. Probably the first and most celebrated effort was the Delgado et al. 1999 Livestock Revolution piece, which came out in 1999, which demonstrated that, well, as we consume As we get richer, we consume more livestock. As we get more urbanized, we also consume more livestock. And when we put this together with population increases, well, they found that the demand for livestock was really skyrocketing, and particularly for the monogastric sector, pigs and poultry. So, but the agenda has changed in complexity. We started in those, in those days it was really all about dealing with food security, trade, and poverty reduction. This was the late 90s. Then we started engaging in environmental concerns, and the seminal publication of the Livestock Long Shadow made a lot of us really, got us on our toes to really think at how to achieve greater sustainability for the sector. So then it became about greenhouse gas emissions, later land use, later nutrients, biodiversity. Now we're in a phase of diets and health, slowly integrating all these things in the projections that we have. Now we're thinking about, well, while there are things, the enabling environment doesn't work, is what we say. Well, we need to find ways of bypassing it, like the mobile phones in Africa is what. And yes, there's a lot happening in this space that would be very useful, but all these things have been integrated in projections and so on, and now we're thinking more about uncertainties in these projections. So the agenda is ever evolving, and we need, as I said, to be responsive to the fast pace. Let's look first at what's happened in the past, because I think that that's really important in terms of thinking about the trends. And this is a graph with a lot of numbers, but don't worry about them. Blue means increases, orange means important decreases, and this is the demand for livestock products per capita, per person, so this is not taking the population increases into account. But for example, look, bovine meat. There's this idea that ruminant products are all increasing at, also at fast rates. Bovine meat has actually stagnated. Bovine meat is actually, it's, even if you take at the global level, in the last 20 years, we're eating 200 grams more per capita. That's the reality. And in many places, there's been very significant decreases in the consumption of red meats. So what we see in the big projections is a human population increase effect, but we're not consuming more. Where we're consuming more is where you look at, for example, we're poultrifying our diets. Look at all this blue. Look at places like, look, China. There's some very, very big numbers. Pig meat, 20 kilos per person in the last 20 years in China, 11, and so on. And these are monumental drivers of change in the sector from all perspectives. Take pandemics, take feed, take land use, take supply chains, everything. And this is something that we need to realize very quickly. So for me, the lesson here is let's never talk about a demand for livestock products. Let's make sure that we're talking about the specific species here, because it's completely different. For ruminants, it's very different than for the pigs and poultry. Then seafood is also quite important, and for the ruminants, dairy has been an important source. Then if we go to how are we supplying those products, for me the biggest worrying trend is that the production growth, production at the country level is still driven largely by increases in animal numbers. And this poses an enormous burden on local resources. Feeds, land use, water, competition between food and feed areas, etc. So what we've always advocated, which is trying to get sustainable intensification growing, has not really worked fully. And it's only where we see some little gains. It's, for example, in mixed crop livestock systems, especially, for example, in when you look at this, the gray bars are increases in productivity versus increases in bovine numbers. So what we see here is that, for example, the temperate areas of the world or the highlands have seen small reductions or even numbers of animals staying the same with some increases in productivity. So there's a little bit of evidence of how this is actually playing. And this is important because we tend to invest, we always, in dairy as one of the things where we see could be really important for the future of food security. It's say in sub-Saharan Africa and in other places. But for red meat, no, for red meat it's all driven by increases in animal numbers, and that's a little bit problematic. I'm in my fourth or fifth slide, and I know I'm talking a hell of a lot because Gareth just told me that I have 3 minutes, and that's really scary. But it doesn't matter. Look, you're getting the message. So back to now to the future. Where are we? Projection models have been used usually by agricultural economists working in conjunction with us, with the commodity sector specialists. There's a range, some called partial equilibrium models that will actually take primarily the agricultural sector, and you will be able to specify significantly how you deal with with a lot of detail. But then you have computable general equilibrium models where you have a whole economy, so you can include the energy sector, etc. Those would provide a range of things, and all the way to spreadsheets and so on. So these are some of the most common ones that have dealt. There's in total about 17, and some of them have specifications of the livestock sector. Well, some better than others. Some of the results for the future, and I'll just present 2 or 3 slides here just so that you can actually see this. This is work that my colleague Daniel, who is sitting at the back there, he's a reasonably new member to the community, has been dealing. It's really trying to get the outputs of all these models to really understand what's the uncertainty in the projections that we get into the future to 2050. The models differ a lot in their assumptions. So sometimes you find the occasional one that says that the prices are going down, while all the other ones say that the prices are going up, and so on. So especially for things like the IPCC and the big reports, the uncertainty level and knowing if at least the direction of change that we're picking is the same one becomes really important. So here are the kinds of things that you see. Ruminant production, demand and prices. So if you look at, this is aggregated in production, Africa and the Middle East, about 150% increases to 2050 is what we will need to actually to satisfy that consumption that will hit also higher levels. The rest will be trade. But there's some uncertainty, especially because of the linkages with prices, with trade, etc. While if you look at other places like Europe, it's quite certain that it's going to be a little bit of an increase, but not that much. Yeah.
I'll give you 30 seconds to wrap up.
Right. Okay. And then you can see the same kinds of things of prices and so on. These kinds of things are really important for us because we need to know where the sector is going and what are the kinds of targets that we're trying to reach. For example, take any country in Africa, knowing what the demand for livestock products, for the different livestock products is fundamental, and especially for donors to really create, develop credible strategies on the types of products and the types of outcomes that we actually need to achieve. So I'll just leave it here, if that's okay.
Thanks, Mario. And Mario is here all week, so if you would like to see the rest of the slide deck. Following Mario, we've now got Ugo from FAO, who's going to talk specifically about sustainable livestock in Africa. Yep, so save your questions until the end. There's a group discussion activity.
Hello, good morning. I'm going to tell you a very short story in 10 minutes. It took about 3 years to develop the story. And it's not my story. I mean, there's Orsi, Lorenzo, I see Dominique, and Wes Juicy, and Lucia, a number of people behind this story. And thanks also, Andrew, to you, SID, you provided some resources. So we had a project in Africa, which is called Africa Sustainable Livestock 2050. It's still active. And it had two major objectives, or has two major objectives. The first one was to sort of explore the future of the African livestock to anticipate emerging challenges and trends. And then, of course, based on our understanding of the future, we would like to provide evidence for improved policies at country level. And we are now in this second phase. So we did three basic things, We did three things. First, we did try to characterize existing livestock production systems and also understand how they contribute to livelihoods and affect the environment and public health. Then we tried actually to rely on quantitative projections and foresight methodologies to understand how the livestock sector could look like in 2050. And as you can imagine, there are plenty of livestock sectors that could be in Africa in 2050. And we try really to understand also what could be the impact on livelihoods, environment, and public health. And then we are trying now to generate some robust recommendations for countries and for the entire continent. Now, Mario already mentioned some of the mega trends, and these are basically the three underlying, let's say, determinants of the demand for livestock products. Population, and in Africa is going to double from 1.2 to 2.5 billion in the next 30 years. Urbanization, and you know, today Africa is 40% urbanized. It will be about 70% urbanized in 2050. And consumer purchasing power, GDP per capita, is going to increase by 300% according to FAO projections in the next 30 years. And of course, as people, you know, are more urbanized and better off, they're going to demand more and more livestock products. And, you know, we expect actually that this is an example for meat. Meat consumption is going to increase by 170% in Africa. And you know, we have projections for the different types of meat, for milk and other livestock products. But what I think is very important, and it took months to generate this model, is to show actually that the demand will be largely in urban areas. Today is about half, about 55% of the demand is in urban areas. In 2050, we estimated about 70% of the demand of livestock products will be in urban areas. And we're talking about demand. If you think at market, so if you exclude self-consumption, perhaps it's 80% or 90% of the markets will be in urban areas. And this means that there are going to be radical changes, of course, in livestock production systems. And projections also say that, you know, as Mario said, you know, producers are going to respond. They're going to increase the number of animals, increase productivity, and here are some of the FAO projections. We expect in the next 30 years for meat that, you know, beef production is going to increase by 170%, poultry production 285%, small ruminant meat 170%. Now, if you are a producer, you need to decide where to locate your production, right? And there are a number of variables that you are looking at. Where I'm going to put, you know, my farm. And for sure, you're looking at infrastructure, right? And these are actually two graphs that show what's the current situation of infrastructure in Africa. Here we have the railway network, and that's the night light. Now, regardless of all the investments that are going to happen in Africa in the next 20 or 30 years, do you think Africa will be closer to Europe or even India in the next 30 years? Or not really. So where you're going to put your livestock farm? Perhaps around urban and peri-urban areas. And this is a map of Kampala today. That's the human population density, observed data, okay? So no any model here. And here you have, the darker the color, the higher the population density. Look at poultry in Uganda. Where are the poultry birds? The poultry birds are really around Kampala. Look at here. Here it's all Uganda, right? Where is the higher density of poultry birds in Uganda? Around Kampala. And that's also for cattle. I mean, if you think of dairy producers, I mean, higher density of cattle are for sure also around urban and peri-urban areas. So, of course, feed plays a role here, but we expect actually that there will be a number of emerging livestock farms for poultry and for dairy in particular around urban and peri-urban areas. So we're going to have in the future higher human and livestock population density in urban areas. And there will be environmental issues and public health issues. I mean, Africa GDP today is $1,500 per year. In China it's about 7,000, and they had the coronavirus, last week. In the live bird market, imagine, what can happen in Africa in the next 20 or 30 years. And Africa will not be where China is today in the next 30 years. And just to show you really what are the challenges, because I think that we are not really ready with our mind to understand. Look at this. This is Nairobi population, right? Today is 3.9 million. We expect in 2050 the population to become 14.3 million. That means about 300,000 people per year more will move to Nairobi, which means that per day it's 900 people. I mean, this is something that a city like Rome or like London would have difficulty in managing, and it's happening, and this is just Nairobi. I mean, if you look at all Africa major towns, it is happening everywhere. So we really expect, that in the future, there will be significant issues in urban and peri-urban areas. And what is really the problem that we are facing is that if you look at current policies and strategies, our, research focus, we focus on rural areas. We like smallholders in rural areas, we have pastoral people, and we completely negate urban and peri-urban agriculture. I mean, policies don't care about urban and peri-urban agriculture. Urban planners are not involved in our discussion about the future of agriculture and livestock. And to us, this is a major gap. Unless today we start engaging them in a discussion about the sustainable development of livestock, we are going to bump into significant problems in the future, not only for Africa, if you think of the zoonotic diseases, but for the entire world. 10 minutes, I guess.
Perfect timing. So from Ugo, we're now going to move over onto a tag team of Obai and Luc, and they're going to talk specifically about the size of the animal health market in Africa. So again, just keep your questions and we'll get to that in the second part of the session.
Thank you very much. So just a quick introduction. It's actually Luc who is going to do the presentation. So just one thing to say that for any strategic exercise, before realizing, or taking the decision, how do we want to get there, we have to know where we are now, and we have to know where do we want to go. So, and this is, I'm not going to preach to the choir about the importance of data, but if we don't have data, there is no strategy. Our strategy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is towards achieving the country-led inclusive agricultural transformation. We as livestock team, we do that by increasing the productivity of animals owned by the poor livestock keepers. We are talking about huge yield gaps, as all of you are experts on that. And we try to focus on two areas. One is increasing the adoption of innovative technologies and the availability of innovative products. And the other side is really linking the farmers with the offtake market. And we work through three bodies of work. One is animal systems, focusing on the whole policies and regulations at the country level. One is animal production. We have many of our partners here who are doing the real work. and the other one is animal health. In animal health, we have already been engaged in developing also through many partners, some of them are here, in developing and registering. We have already done maybe like 6, 7 vaccines out of 14 priority diseases. But one thing we realize that if we don't enhance public-private partnerships, if we don't really bring private sector, we will not be able to stimulate innovation. We will not be able to get our actually interventions at scale and sustainably available to the farmers. But engaging private sector, we have to tell a story about what does it mean for them in terms of market potential and what actually level of market are we talking about. So there are different platforms which makes data available, like CISA, like Vetnosis, etc. If you want actually information, there is very accurate information about the market size of oncology products for dogs in the French Riviera, for example. But if you are looking for the market size of East Coast fever, of rinderpest, of PPR, different products in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a challenge. And that's what we are trying to tackle now. So I will just pass it over to Luc.
Thank you. Bye. How do I get? All right, good. So, in fact, what I'm going to present to you is a model that Obai has asked me, in fact, to develop for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And in fact, the challenge that I have, I mean, this such model, I've already done once this work for my previous employer, the company Zoetis, in 2014. And basically what we do is we start from the animal population and we look at, you know, if animals have been vaccinated or not, do they get sick or not, what type of treatments they receive, and what is the value, I mean, they're going to produce in terms of the animal health market size, which means we look at the dose, we look at the price, we look at the regimen. But if we build a model like this, the interest is that it also helps you to do some projections. If vaccination rate would be increased, if treatment rates would be increased, if compliance on the dose and the regimen would be better, if prices increase, and if some disease which might be minor today develop, you could get an idea of not only what is the potential market that you could reach today, but what could become the market in the coming years. Now, the goal is to define for each species a model to estimate the market size. It's not rocket science, but it requires input of data which are relatively reliable. If you put dust in, you get dust out. Now, that's why I'm not an expert in any of the disease I'm putting into the model, and I suppose that probably most of the knowledge is available in this room on the majority of the disease which I'm going to touch. So your help will be certainly needed. Now, what the challenge for me is also to take into account the different production scheme which are used in the countries where Obai has asked me to focus. Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Nigeria at first. The idea would be to develop a model which is not excluding any production scheme which might be used in other countries, not only in those 3 countries. Now, the model I had developed for Zoetis was rather simple compared to that, because I was considering each species in a country as a farm. Here, I will have 5 different farms, which makes the things a little more complex. And then we populate the model, and we take the best assumption we have, and we run it. Now, what type of production scheme, I mean, did Obai mention to me? He mentioned 5 different schemes, a pastoral one, and 4 which are sedentary. 2 of them can be grouped into so-called intensive commercial producers, which could be or dairy or meat-producing feedlots. 2 interesting ones. One is a smallholder farmer, and the other is a mixed crop livestock producer. One is close to the cities, the other are probably more autarcic. Now, what needs to be put into each model is, for the species which are relevant, the type of animals which are used, and how they are bred. I do understand, you know, that a dairy farm is run very differently from a feedlot. So we have to take assumption that makes sense. Now, what we do also is we segment each species. I think it's important for certain, if you speak of dogs and cats, of course, the lifespan of the animal is rather simple. When you're speaking of animals which are livestock producing animals, you need to consider at which speed the cycle is running and what is the lifespan of the animal in each segment. When you're starting fattening animals, are you doing fattening of animal in 6 months, a short cycle, or are you fattening them on a 12 months? It's going to be different in the way they will be raised, so it's going to be different in the number of cycles of animals which will be produced during a year. Especially when you touch poultry, it becomes obvious. So what we do then is we estimate for each segment the number of animals produced during a given time period. Now I took two examples to show you. In the terms of cattle, this is how I would propose a segmentation. It can be simplified, it can be more complex. The AFERs could be grouped. You can separate your AFERs from the first year, which might receive, double vaccination as a first vaccination program, from the one which will be older and might receive just a booster. You can group your cows, beef and dairy cows, if you have a dual system with dual breeds. I mean, you try to keep it simple. But basically, with such a simple segmentation of your cattle, you can explain the cycle. The same with poultry. Now, in the terms of poultry, I would not use, the animals which represent the grandparents or the genetics. They are very valuable, but in terms of numbers, in terms of size of market, it's negligible. What makes the markets are the production animal and the breeders. And you would consider, those segments, you would segment those two steps of the pyramid, and you probably then would explain 95 to 99% of the market value. Now, disease and conditions. Which disease to consider? And that's where it can be tricky, because some of the disease, especially the one which might be the most serious, you might not have a vaccine, you might even not have a treatment, but you still want to take them into consideration because some vaccine someday might come, and you would like the model to be ready to take it. You want also to take into account diseases which have not only major economical impact, but also impact on the human health. So every zoonotic disease, I would make sure, that it should be in the model. Emerging disease, sometime, if you take lumpy skin disease as an example, some years ago, people might not have been worried with it. Now they get a little more worried, especially with, the way it has been spreading recently. And you would project your model maybe on something which, in my case, I would say can be foreseen. I do not project on 50 years. If I project on 5 to 10 years market data, there is so much incertitude, that after 10 years, you might redo another model. The key point for me is to get a reasonable picture of the market size as it is actually, and how could be its potential today, and then to project. So what is important is the consistency, and I would say probably to get an order of magnitude of which segment represent how much. It doesn't need to be 100% accurate, but you need to have an idea of what is the size of your antibiotics, what is the size of your antiparasitic products, your acaricide versus your insecticides, to get an idea. Is it more important in cattle? Is it more important, in sheep? That's the type of things you would like to know. Now the market valuation. We would use treatments, which would be reference treatment. We would take things rather simply, maximum 2 products, per disease. So you would have a disease with a prevention, a disease with a treatment scheme. We would use, of course, active ingredients, and we would remain neutral as for the product. We don't want necessarily to advertise for any product. And we would use the most common formulation and strengths of the product. We use at the officially approved and recommended dose and regimen. And we would take the actual compliance rate. If we use 100% compliance rate, we would get then the total potential market value. The value of the product, we would use local purchase costs in local currency, and we would convert it into US dollar in order to aggregate data from different countries. And we would start always the same, from the numbers of animals, with the condition, the number, the incidence of the disease, whether they are treated, they would be medicalized. You have a medicalization rate, a treatment rate, a dose, a regimen, you would have your potential dose. And then depending on the compliance, you would get or the actual cost of the treatment. And if you put your compliance at the maximum, which is 100 for the dose and the regimen, you would get the potential market you could reach. And the same for the price. Which price would you take? Now, when I used to work at Zoetis, we would consider this price level, because that's the way we would look at things. How much, do we sell into the market? Now, presently, I would recommend that we take this price, which is probably going to be different depending on the production scheme, because some animal owners might buy from a retailer, some other might buy from a wholesaler. You might have in some countries different level of wholesalers. You can have 2, 3 steps between, you know, the makers and the animal owner. But if you take this level of price, you could compare apples to apples. And that would be it. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks, Luc and Obai. And to finish off, we have Claudia, who'll be talking about emerging and future challenges for livestock disease.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm Claudia. I'm working on animal health. Sorry. Okay. I'm an ecologist and do risk modeling on animal diseases here in FAO and the Animal Health Service. Our mandate is to prevent, contain, and control the major livestock diseases at their source, while also surveying for emerging pathogens in a changing environment. And among other activities, core activities are early warning, forecasting, and early detection to enhance early action and response. So forecasting and disease modeling is really important for us, and is more than just plotting disease events, of course. It's trying to understand, estimating, predicting, forecasting, and displaying risk of emergence, spread, and persistence on animal health threats using risk maps and providing risk maps. When the risk maps becomes, a useful tool, of course, if they can inform decision making, support animal disease prevention, management, and control. Our aim is to use these maps in order to have risk-based surveillance, in order to prioritize vaccination, vector control, biosecurity, control measure, and etc. We work on different diseases, but in terms of forecasting, Rift Valley fever is one of our focus. Rift Valley fever is major viral vector-borne disease. It's transmitted by different mosquitoes and has a really, being a vector-borne disease, the climate and the environment has a big component. It's a really big driver. And so seasonal patterns are influenced by environmental anthropogenic factors, and any change in those factors here, the host, the pathogen, and the environment can determine an increase in the emergence of the disease and can facilitate the emergence, the spread, and the transmission. So, for the Rift Valley fever, as for other vector-borne disease, there is a big, really environmental dynamic component, the climate, that we monitor. For example, changes in the climate patterns can affect the host, the pathogen, the vector distribution, and the ecosystem in terms of availability, accessibility of water, food, and shelter. And such changes are expected to increase due to climate change. So this is important because we expect to have more Rift Valley fever events, not only in Africa, where now the disease is confined, but also to Europe and Middle East. So there is a growing concern. FAO is very active on Rift Valley fever, and over the past 10 years, together with different partners like NASA, WHO, have successfully forecasted hotspots for Rift Valley fever amplification, so for this explosion of the vectors, the infected vectors, providing recommendation, early warning messages for country at risk. We have an early warning system here at FAO that we developed together with our partners, and then we enhanced and improved. And our aim is to be, this is the epidemic of the disease, to be here with the early warning. So to identifying those factors, those signs, in order to see, if there are conditions, suitable conditions for the vector to amplify and then to transmit the disease. And if we are able to detect these signs here, then we are able to have to mitigate, of course, to prevent and the effect of the disease. We have, as I said, the dynamic model, which builds upon the work by NASA, by Anyamba, and is based on DVI and rainfall, so vegetation and rainfall anomalies as a proxy for ecological dynamics to map areas at potential risk of Rift Valley fever. It's a dynamic model. This means that we monitor continuously the climate and the environment using remote sensing, and we are able to, with some calibration that we have done at FAO in different regions of Africa, recently we are able to produce maps at monthly basis on resolution of 250 meters. And an achievement that we have done recently is to move from a desktop to a cloud-based platform using Google Earth Engine. So this one has actually allowed us to be much quicker in producing these risk maps and providing this information to our stakeholders. And if you see here, I mean, this map shows the forecasted Rift Valley fever events that we have done also together with our partners, NASA as well, and WHO and OIE, the date of the alert when was issued, and the date of reporting of the disease and the date of observation. For example, the last outbreak, we issued, sorry. We issued the alert for the whole Horn of Africa the 16th of October, and the disease was reported in January in Uganda and observed in December last month. So we are now able, in general, to have a better prediction time, almost 2-3 months before an event occurred. And this one is important in order to, I mean, inform our stakeholder, the CVO. Usually what we do is to FAO issues an alert. This is an example for February 2018, April 2018. We know that in East Africa, Rift Valley fever major outbreak occurred last year. But is this enough? Is this enough to actually trigger early action? Although we have a different strengths of our early warning, I mean, that we can highlight here, I mean, because it's cost effective. I mean, in Google Earth Engine, for example, our early warning system is totally free of cost because we are able to use the satellites and etc. And of course, we need to improve our model, particularly in some areas where we don't have outbreaks. So there is still some work to be done on the modeling thing. But we realized last year, for example, in a big meeting, a regional meeting on Rift Valley fever in Africa, in Tanzania, that although we are able to provide these risk maps to our stakeholders, they don't always trigger early action. And the reason is that risk maps are difficult to be interpreted. Most of the time, these probability maps are very difficult. So the stakeholders have difficulties in understanding, in then moving to an action. And we also realized that if these maps are also linked to recommended key messages, then this will facilitate, will guide early action. So in terms of Rift Valley fever, where a lot of work has been done, and many actually consultation meetings have been, done in East Africa, we have a lot of work already on preparedness and contingency plans. And for example, these are two works. There are paper works on a decision support tool, which actually include risk maps and also the recommended actions in the different phases of the epidemiology of the disease. But this is a paperwork. So what we realized, for example, during this meeting in Tanzania was that our stakeholders, also the chief veterinary officers, when an emergency comes, it's difficult to, I mean, they don't have time basically to go through all these papers, all these documents and see what needs to be done. So what we decided was to create an early warning decision support tool, so a digital one, which now integrates the early warning system that we have developed here at FAO with also other geospatial data, expert knowledge to actually reclassify the risk maps in a way that is more understandable, like in a traffic lights. And so we skip now the suitability and the probability values. And we link with We link also with recommended actions coming from these documents that I mentioned before. So this is now ongoing, so it's a test environment where we put together the risk maps, the risk factors, and the drivers like forecasted rainfall, observed rainfall, cumulative anomalies. I mean, all these information that we need to build our model on a near real-time basis, but also linking with recommended actions in order to support and to guide decisions at country level. Our countries now focus of this project is Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and we have already got some achievements. For example, recently Rwanda has vaccinated almost 70% of the livestock. Following our FAO alert and the risk maps. We have synergized with the Emergency Management Center here at FAO to activate incident coordination groups, and also based on these risk maps and documents, a response mission was recently implemented in Uganda, where there is an ongoing outbreak. And this is my last. I want to acknowledge and thank all the colleagues. Our colleagues tomorrow will also talk about our information systems and the mobile applications. And so we are consumer of livestock data, but we are trying also to use modeling in order to be, to support the decision making through this also tool that integrates different data. So thank you very much. And if you want to know more, there are some brochures on the tool. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Claudia, and thank you to all our speakers this morning who have taken us from the global megatrends right down to some specific examples.
Great, thanks, Di. Yeah, that was a great kind of overview of some of the key trends in the livestock sector. So that's a lot of food for thought. There's going to be a chance to reflect on some of what we heard this morning now. So as I said, a lot of food for thought. What I'm going to ask you to do is to reflect on what you heard, have a conversation at your tables. What was surprising? Were there any gaps? What are some of the implications of what you heard? How does this relate to livestock data for decisions? And then on the basis of that conversation, each group, I'd like you to agree on one burning question that you'd like to ask the speakers. And after we've had that conversation for 15 minutes or so, I'll invite all the speakers to come and sit at the front, and I'll give you each table the chance to ask your burning question to the presenters. Okay, I'm going to call you back to order. And I'm going to start with this table. So who's your spokesperson? Andy?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, panel. Mario's statement that increase in production will be has been as a result of increase in animal numbers as opposed to an increase in productivity. And it's obviously very clear, given the population trends, urbanization, etc., that we're going to need that improvement in productivity in coming years. So it's obviously quite depressing that I think despite all the effort that has gone in, productivity hasn't increased measurably. So my question is, our question is, sorry, what do we need to do to shift that dial in terms of productivity, particularly in LMICs?
Well, you can start, Mario, and then.
Andy, that's a really important question, and I suppose that it can be divided into several parts. the increases in productivity have not been happening for a range of reasons. I think in places like sub-Saharan Africa and so on. For example, one is the amazingly high cost of some of the options that we really need to try to start bringing down, and probably more interaction with the private sector will be really important. I think that there are issues related also to scale, where you have in many cases we might need a little bit more of a slightly larger farms in many cases to really start making livestock production a true semi-commercial or more commercial operation that farmers can actually make a living from. And that's something that we often fail to discuss, because sometimes we are just stuck in the smallholder sector and trying to maintain and perpetuate a smallholder sector that sometimes, simply by the operation size, if you have one cow and you increase productivity from 2 liters to 10, well, that's probably going to do some good, but it might not be enough to really create an enormous amount of wealth. So the benefits of livestock for wealth creation will need to be dealt with appropriately, I think, to create a pull factor so that technology can actually increase and so on. And this is something that, well, you know, different donors, different development agencies will have a different view on, but it is something that I think it's opportune to start discussing as an option.
I wondered if I could follow up with that. In relation to these trends in urbanisation, etc., do you think those changes will happen as a matter of course in terms of increase in farm size, specialisation, intensification, etc.?
We always thought that, but we don't see, we see, for example, very significant changes in the poultry and the monogastric sectors, with increases in industrialization relative to smallholder poultry and pig units. That's occurring, and that actually, that structural change drives changes in yields and everything. But in the ruminant sector, we used to do a lot of data collection at ILRI, trying to find whether that consolidation is happening, and it's not happening. It hasn't been occurring. Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments from the panel? Oh, there's one from the audience. Yeah. Is this your question? Is this your group question? No?
Can I just one more thing? The hypothesis that we always had was that as land values increase in peri-urban areas, you start really building more, well, buildings and everything, and all of a sudden it becomes real estate, and theoretically the farm sizes shrink, so you actually pull the production a little bit further as the land rents increase. But in many parts of, I mean, we're still in that transition where you have the mix of both things. You have a lot of, many places in South Asia or Southeast Asia, where you have incredible numbers of animals cohabiting with people. There's changes of hands and more buildings and more urban dwellings, but the animals still stay. That movement of the animals further out sometimes doesn't occur as fast as we think. But probably Marius and team also know about these things a fair bit, I think, in case there's more comments.
Okay, I'm going to move to this table. I think we're going to move the conversation on, but you have Bashir is your spokesperson.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. So our burning question here is, eventually what you want is to effect changes in behavior. That's adoption of whatever outcome you've come up with. So how do you ensure that? Because, I mean, if you've done a beautiful work, beautiful study, and you are not able to translate that to practice, to make the impact that you want to see, then how do you think you can make sure that whatever you do, there's the level of adoption that you want from the end user?
Okay, so was the question clear, and who wants to answer it? Ugo.
Oh, thanks for this question. I think that we need data. And let me be a bit provocative. I mean, all the data that we collect only portrays the current situation, right? They cannot tell us how to move forward, right? Because we are going to do new things. So what's very important is to collect data on the ground on what we can call the delivery mechanism, right? You know, how you change behavior of farmers. I mean, should you train them, or you should train community leaders, right? You don't know ex ante, right? And basically, we only collect data that assist us in identifying problems or opportunities, right? But then we don't have any information at all on how to address the problems or tap into the opportunities, or the scattered information here and there. We should have a more systematic approach to learn, or to collect, I would say, data on what are the good practices to deliver, in a certain way, certain messages to farmers, right? And this is a gap, I mean, because we can actually collect as much as data as we want, but it's always about the current situation. It's not about how to move forward. And this is something the community of practice should think of.
Claudia?
Yes, of course. I mean, in addition to what Hugo has said, the involvement of the communities, the stakeholders, is important. Often information are already there with the communities. For example, for the Rift Valley fever, maybe they may use different not scientific words for the Rift Valley fever and how to deal with that, but they know pretty well. And so participatory approach are really important for connection of the data as well, and to learn, and involvement of stakeholders, so that they are part of the situation, the issue from the beginning, not at the end. Yeah.
Good. Any other comments, Luc?
Just what I could say is that in the case of a model like the one for estimating the size of the market, you're not here to tell to people, you know, where they should invest, but they will make the decision if they look at the type of data you can generate on the size of the market, and on the other hand, they would look at the data generated by a group who is working on the impact of disease. And you see a certain impact of a disease, you see how much is spent on it, and how much you could potentially spend on it. And then, does that make an interest? You have then to make a decision, but you do it based on information. You have at least something to make your decision in a way which makes sense. But the model will not tell you what to do. It will just give you the tools to decide.
So you believe that the market will drive adoption?
I think it could at least show the opportunity to some players and to people who wants to make decisions, or guide them in probably targeting a certain disease rather than another. Can it be eradicated? Can it be controlled? At what cost? What are the benefits for doing it?
Okay, good. Any comments from the floor? There's one at the back.
Hi, sorry, I'm one of the FAO floaters. I think there's also a need to identify the communication strategies, because if we have the data, and if we have the data analysis, and we want the users, whether they're communities in the field or decision makers more in the policy level, there's a step in between, which is translating the data into communication messages. We talked a little bit about that in our group, targeting specific stakeholders in different ways.
Okay, so translating data into digestible communication pieces is important. Yep. Good. So table 3, I sense there was a bit of anarchy going on at this table in terms of coming up with a question. And so Tim is your spokesman. Is he your spokesman? Yeah.
So no, there wasn't anarchy, but we did discuss a wide range of issues, including the real business model behind public-private partnerships, what the sources of data are, the importance of environmental impacts of changing production systems and production amounts. But the question we have is about Rift Valley fever, but possibly not just about the Rift Valley fever model, but also about predictions and projections in general. And it's really, how are the links made between the outputs of these models or projections and action that is taken, okay? And what's the importance of precision in linking prediction to action? Yep. And is that precision monitored?
So that's a challenging question, and I'm looking at Claudia. I think you're the one to answer. Yeah.
Thanks for the questions. Yeah, well, of course, the accuracy, precision is very important because actually we want to identify the areas that are at risk. And not only identifying the areas at risk in general, but also in a timely manner. And that's why we rely on remote sensing. But we need also to have validation in the near real time, which is something that we are missing still. So in the future, what we want to do is not only providing these risk maps and link with key messages for the decision maker, but also have a system that check the information on the ground and the precision, the accuracy level. And with this, we want to engage with the One Health platform in order to have a network of experts at country level that can help in identifying, validating these risk maps and also eventually the recommended actions. So a key is to have all the stakeholders involved. So it's not a top-down work, but rather, an engagement of the country level, so at field level. Yeah, I don't know if I have.
So who are the users of your maps?
So we actually we have done 2 workshops on that to identify with the countries. At the moment, we have started with 3 countries, and we understood that there is an interest at 2 different levels. So at technical level, so the veterinarians, the epidemiologists at country level, that they are able then with training to use this tool, but also at a policy level, because actually this could be a tool for scenario analysis and able to advocating for resources. Because in terms of Rift Valley fever, what is the issue is that a way of controlling is vaccination, but the disease has a periodicity that now is changing because of climate change, but can occur every 5 or 15 years. And the time life of the vaccine is much shorter than the disease and the recurring of the disease. So, and it's very expensive, so they are not able to keep these vaccines in their shelves. And this means that in order to, once you have really a threat, they need to start producing the vaccines. So that's really an issue. So if they are able to allocate money for having stocks of vaccine based on this scenario, so they will be able then also to vaccinate when there is a need. So having a tool depicting, let's say, predicting, and having these scenarios will also, we understood from the countries, to advocate for money, for funding, and buying, the control measures that are important for the control of this disease, mitigation of the disease. Yeah.
Okay. Is that an adequate answer, Tim? And anyone else want to, Mario?
Can I add to that? Probably from a projections perspective. It's quite interesting. Daniel and I started thinking of all of this when comparing. We said, well, we're almost in 2020, and the original Delgado et al. Projections were to 2020. So we said, well, let's compare the projections from the mid-90s to what is really happening. And it's amazing. They got it largely right. Consumption of animal protein within 5 kilos, something like that. At the global level, of course, for beef it was quite tight. For poultry there were larger differences because, and one crucial outlier, China. In China, they never expected in those days the increases in dairy consumption that happened way faster than anywhere. and also the increases in poultry productivity. When they were dealing with projected increases in productivity, they assumed that productivity was going to increase by a factor of 2, and it increased a lot faster by a factor of 3. So that brought prices down, and that generated further increases in consumption in some of the middle-income countries. And that's actually what, but in general terms, look, I would, for those who didn't believe, they pick it up pretty well. And then in terms of how important are the projections for decision making, we recently did for Belinda and Hannah, who is not here, Hannah Reid, an analysis of what's the key data that governments use for developing budgets for agriculture and so on. And projections of demand are one of the key things that they are interested in. That really goes into the planning process. The supply side less, but that's what actually drives the research plans and trying to increase the production and so on. But the projections of demand do go into the planning.
Good. So Mario, you said we were almost in 2020. I'll remind you we actually are.
No, we are in 2020, yeah. Sorry.
Okay, table 4.
Yeah. Hi. So our question is, the risk models presented here are mostly based on agroecological data, but the mitigation of those risks is going to come from changes in human behavior. So is there any scope or is there any work being done to explore modeling those changes in human behavior?
No. No.
Okay, so table 5.
I try to keep my model as simple as possible. No, I cannot predict, and I would not pretend.
No one willing to kind of speculate on whether we can model human behavior?
Would not try.
Luc wouldn't try? But it's a kind of key, it's a key thing, unless we can, we can't change the agroecology very easily, but we might be able to change human behavior. Anyone want to comment?
Yes, I'm Lorenzo, working at FAO Global Perspective Studies. We do model consumer behavior because we have to speculate a bit about what could happen if, and as a matter of fact, we may not be able to influence through policies, through education, through whatever, but we have scenarios for consumers acting in different ways, and depending on the way consumers will act, you may have a scenario or another scenario. So in a sense, projections are not pure predictions, so projections are scenario contingent ways of looking into the future. And of course, the way people act is a fundamental variable to model.
Yeah, comment from here.
Yeah, I think the questions are pretty interesting about the human behavior. I think we had a similar question too. Answer is also honest. I appreciate that. But there's, as you just pointed out, there are perhaps studies in behavioral economics by, say, for example, Richard Thaler or Daniel Kahneman, etc. Can they be adopted in intersection with the kind of data that we are seeing? Is a sort of, you could say, follow-up question or a comment in general.
Okay, so we could use behavioral economics to address this question. Do we have any behavioral economists in the room? No? But Annie, you want to say something?
I'd like to ask a follow-up question, and I think probably to Claudia. Even if you get the very best near real-time predictions of an upcoming disaster, are you managing to be any more successful than we have been in the past about interacting with the government budget cycle, which can be very slow?
I'm not sure if I understood very well your question, sorry. So you said if we are able to...
Okay, so you come up with a really good prediction that says that within the next 3 months we're going to have an outbreak of something which will kill people and stop you exporting your sheep. You need to do something, guys. And the government people say, yeah, that's great, but my budget doesn't come in for another 6 months.
Yes, yes. And this is what I was saying before, that when we had this workshop and we understood that at government, at policy level, this tool could be useful for advocacy, because actually, yeah, you can inform, but if you don't have money to do anything, then the tool will not be useful. This is something that happens, for example, for Rift Valley fever, because it's something recurring maybe in 10 years. And so they may not have in a stock vaccines, and they may allocate. For example, also now it's a risk period for Rift Valley fever, and there is an ongoing outbreak in Uganda. But there is, on the other side, also the locust emergency. So, I mean, these countries in the Horn of Africa, they are now facing a lot of threats, so where they need to allocate money. I mean, it's difficult, and most of the time, in terms of the Rift Valley fever, they have allocated already money for other, other disasters, other threats. But if we, for example, one of the measures is the vaccination, then they should have in stock this vaccine already. And this is possible if they understand that there will be a threat in the future, and they may now also are aware that this 10-year cycle has been disrupted, for example. Now it's not every 10 years, and we are understanding by doing some analysis on the climate change and variability that the cycle is now shrinking, you know? So it's maybe every 3 or 5 years. So these scenario analysis actually are important also for informing policy and government, and be able for them to be prepared much more in advance. So during the inter-epidemic instead, not during the epidemic or immediately before the epidemic. So this is what we understood from them as well. Thanks.
Yeah, this is kind of at the sharp end of LD4D. You know, the data is potentially the easy part. It's kind of the decision making and what happens after that, which is more challenging. That's always been a struggle. So table 5, do you have a question?
So our group discussed, and it was very interested in the fact, or in this topic of the peri-urban influence in animal production, and how the predictions are saying that it's going to intensify with population growth, and how this ties in with the efficiency concept of having currently more animals is preferred instead of having more efficient animals producing more from less. And also how this affects the social interactions between people in developing countries, and how this also is impacted by the traditional investment model, normally focused on aid money, as opposed as from long-term sustainability business models or things like that. So the pressing question is, how can we use data to support rural development, including infrastructure and investment models outside of peri-urban areas? How can we use data to help develop areas far away from the big cities and help that to structure integrated value chains that help develop non-urban areas?
Okay, so did you get the question? It's about kind of, I think Ugo presented that maybe most of the action is going to be in urban areas, but these guys are interested in the rural areas. So.
Well, I think that if we want to, in general, I mean, that's for everything. If we want to inject some change, we need to show either to the government or to the public sector what are the returns on investment. You know, and you can have rural areas where you can show actually that investing in certain livestock commodities can generate handsome return, right? And that's the only way I believe one can try really to facilitate in a certain way the development of certain rural areas versus urban areas. And of course you need a variety of more than data, I would say you need a variety of factors in place, for these returns of investment to be positive. But unless we show there are good returns of investment, I mean, I think it will be very difficult for anyone to invest in remote areas.
Okay. Mario? Yep.
For example, in Latin America, what drove the creation of bigger livestock industries was the investment in roads, in the road network. In many parts, that actually brought in the services needed, and together with land tenure rights, that actually helped farmers invest in livestock production. They found a way of putting the markets into the urban areas and so on, and that's crucial. That's, for example, the typical model of the dairy industry, say in Central America. It was road networks, then the milking machines came, and all the rest. But
so what are the implications for Africa then?
The implications for Africa, it's slightly different because agroecology in many places played a really important role. For example, you had in Latin America, this happened in the humid tropics, so you had between 2,000 and 3,000 millimeters of rainfall. So you could actually achieve the productivity levels to have very viable dairy production, grass grow year-round, etc. But when you actually have more agroecological constraints, it does become very different, even if you have the roads, because you're not going to put those dairy units in. I mean, it's very difficult to intensify Machacos further, or try to go to Samburu or Nanyuki. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Kenya, for example. And then the picture is quite different in terms of production and productivity. I don't know, Dai, would you like to, do you know anything about how Australia developed their industries? But it wasn't really in the faraway places. No, sorry, I just put you on the spot there.
Okay, table 6, the last table. Who's your spokesperson? Randall is apparently.
We reckoned that all the questions would have been asked by now, and Mario was in any case sitting at the table. So the question we came up with was, Mario, what's the question you would like us to ask you?
So Mario, what's the question you would like the audience to ask you? Okay, so it's about incentives. So that brings us back to the first question, really. Incentives to increase productivity. Has anyone got any?
You know, it's about upscaling. We have, for example, all this community has participated in many projects that are relatively discrete in small places, pilot projects. The pilot never fails and the pilot never scales, and that is maintained throughout. So how are we going to go forward with lifting that barrier? What do we really need to do?
Okay. So that's Mario's question to the audience. Anyone want to, Tim, you want to say something on that?
Value chains.
Value chain. Okay.
Because if you can create some value at the end that someone's willing to pay for, and create a value chain so that can be shared all the way. I mean, it sounds obvious and they're not easy to generate, but if there's value at the end and that can be shared back through all of the people in the chain, then that's how businesses form, right? And that's how...
Yeah, so it's about business development then.
I think so.
Yeah. Obai?
Every farmer gets into farming to make money. And for one to scale, there has to be a market. And the market should be able to pay them for their cost and make them have a decent reward. So the challenges that some of the projects have faced is you find the cost of production is not factored in the market buying price. So, which means my suggestion would be part of interventions would be to look at how do we create effective demand for products, and how do we relate the quality of what is being produced, which will be environmentally friendly, with what is being demanded by the consumers. Because like if you come to the part of the world I come from, if you look at milk, milk is regarded as any white material that comes from a cow. And that's all the quality that is described from milk. So if you are to go into what is good quality milk, and then you get a price for what is good quality milk, then many farmers will be encouraged to get this good quality milk because they'll be paid for the quality of the milk. But because the market does not pay a price that enables that quality to come out, then everybody struggles to produce volume. They earn very little money, and then the closing down comes in, and that's why you may not see an increase in intensity of production.
Okay, so there's a consensus that the market is going to be key to this, the market, the value chain. That seems a good point on which to stop. It's 12:30. I think we've had a great session this morning, kicked off LD4D in a very stimulating way, so let's show our appreciation to the speakers.